Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our webinar titled Your 8-Step Apprenticeship Delivery Plan. This webinar is the third in our autumn series, and we thank you for joining us. Before I introduce our main speaker, I'd like to explain a few things about our webinar platform to allow you to get the most out of the experience. All viewers will be in listen-only mode. However, to engage with the webinar, please use the on-screen panel. Using the tabs of this panel, you can adjust your audio settings and choose to see the webcam of our presenters if available. You can also use the questions and chat tabs to engage with us. We expect that our webinar will be extremely popular, but our team will do our best to answer your questions and queries. During the webinar, we'll be running a number of polls. To record your response, please click on the on-screen voting button when asked to do so. After the webinar, we'll be providing a recording of the webinar, a copy of the slides, and a fact sheet to address any unanswered questions. One final thing, I do apologise if you hear a bell in the webinar today. The room we are presenting in is next to a lift. Now I'd like to hand over to our main presenter, Paula Gibson.
Hi everybody, and good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar is all about giving you the right tools and techniques to help you transition towards the new apprenticeship standards. My name is Paula Gibson, and I work in the apprenticeships team here at City and Guilds. I'm delighted to be hosting this webinar today. You're all very welcome. As Jack said, we'll be doing some poll questions across the course of the webinar, and we're going to be leaving the questions until the end. So do think about the kind of things that you want to raise as we go through. So just to sort of touch on the agenda, the purpose of today's webinar is to obviously bring you up to speed with some of the key changes, but also highlight the 8 key steps that we believe are one way forward to transition to the new standards. It's probably worth just mentioning that you may already be starting to do some of this work, which is fantastic if you are. So this could actually begin to reassure you that you are actually on track. Or you could be in a situation where you're not really doing a lot of work in this space at the moment. So hopefully today's webinar will give you the tools and the techniques to help get you started. So what we're going to cover today, I'm just going to do a very quick recap on the reforms and the new funding systems from May onwards. I'll talk a little bit about the dual funding systems and key timelines as we head towards May 2017. And then we're going to get into some of the detail around the 8-step guide that we've designed, which will help you transition to the new standards. I'll talk about additional support that we can offer you as City and Guilds, and as I said to you before, we'll take the questions at the end.
So we have our first poll question of the day, just to set the scene for the webinar. So the question is, how would you best describe your understanding of the new apprenticeship standards? Very good, good, poor, or very poor. Please vote now.
So we're just seeing those results come through. Be interesting to see which stage you're all at in terms of your development.
So I'm just going to share that poll result now. Most people have a very good understanding, which is great.
Fantastic, yeah. Well, that's a really good start. Thanks, Jack. We'll continue to do poll questions as we go through. I think it's a really good way of engaging you in this session, and it helps us really to understand where you're at as well. So do continue to participate in that. So let's just do a very quick recap on the key facts. We know that apprenticeships is having a wholesale change as we move forward to May next year. Over the last couple of years, trailblazer groups have been establishing new standards which will replace the old SACE frameworks. The government is committed to increasing the number of apprenticeship starts by 2020. We've got about 2 million apprentices in the system at the moment, so we've got a fair way to go to get to that 3 million target by 2020. So I think it's really important that we all start to look at growth in apprenticeships across college providers and employers. Another key change, obviously, is the levy, which will be a complete game changer in terms of how employers will respond to apprenticeships, and that will start to be taken from employers' accounts through HMRC from April 2017. And just to recap, if you don't know already, the levy applies to any employer with a pay bill of over 3 million. At the same time, as I said before, the DfE have completely reformed how apprenticeships are designed and delivered, putting the employer at the heart of these changes. And I'm sure you're all working really hard at the moment to get your applications in for the Register of Apprenticeship Training Providers, as well as responding to the ITT to deliver apprenticeships to non-levy paying employers. So there's a lot on at the moment and a lot to do. So they're just an update on the key changes. So let's talk about the funding changes. There's going to be a dual process. Now, this is really important, regardless of whether you're on the new standards or the old or the old SACE frameworks. These two dual funding systems will take place. So for levy fee paying employers, the first levy payment will come out in April. And based on their annual levy contribution, that will be spread out across the course of 12 months. As you start to have conversations with your levy employers, you will need to agree a price per standard or per framework, whatever it is they're going to be offering or what you're going to be offering. And then those monthly deductions will come out of that levy account paid from the SFA directly to the provider. But it's really important that, and we're not going to talk too much about the DAS system, but just to raise at this point, is that the employer will have to put onto the DAS system any apprenticeship activity that's happened in order that is proof that activity has taken place, and you will still need to update ILR in order to get your payments back from the SFA directly to the provider. If the employer runs out of their levy contributions, then obviously co-investment is available based on the 1:9 ratio, which is applied to non-levy paying employers. So that co-investment is really about topping up if those insufficient funds, if those funds run out. So if you're a non-levy paying employer, again from May 2017, for the first time employers will co-invest. They have to contribute 10% towards their apprenticeship training before any training has taken place. So this is a real step change, I think, for how you work with SMEs, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So again, you'll need to agree a price for that standard or for that framework and a payment schedule. So how is that 10% contribution going to be paid to you as a provider? You will then need to start to invoice that employer for that contribution at the start, and then obviously the co-investment contribution with the government will then allow payment from the SFA to come into you as a provider. So I think the key thing here is to say that this will impact whether you're on the old standards or the new frameworks. So having those right systems in place will be absolutely crucial. The only other thing to say is that no co-investment will take place if you are an employer size of 50 or less staff. So for the majority of providers in colleges, etc., you may be working with micro businesses or smaller businesses where no co-investment is applicable. So we're going to take a poll question.
Yeah, so we have a second poll question of the day. What percentage of your apprenticeship provision will be with levy paying employers? 0 to 20%, 21 to 40, 41 to 60, 61 to 80, or 81 to 100?
So we're just seeing those results come in now. Fascinating.
It is. It seems most people are 0 to 20.
Yeah. Interesting.
So we're going to close the voting now. Share that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Really, really interesting. Just to put a bit of context on that, the SFA have suggested that as opposed to 2% of employers who are going to be levy paying employers, they're now saying 1.3. So it's quite interesting, really, because whilst the levy is extremely, a huge game changer for the very large employers, for the majority of our providers will still work with SMEs. So trying to get that piece and position right is going to be key. So let's just talk about the key timelines that are coming. Obviously, the applications for the register is open now, so you've got a deadline for Friday, this Friday. In December, the HMRC are going to be publishing some guidance for levy fee paying employers. Please do look out for that. You will also need to consider how you're going to input your course data into the provider portal course directory find a provider, find a apprenticeship research facility. So really start to think about what does your apprenticeship offer look like that is going to be promoted in that space. Because once providers get access to DAS, once employers get access to DAS in January, then of course that will be the place where they can start to search for a provider to deliver their apprenticeship requirements. So out of those levy fee paying employers that you are working with, I think it's really important to ensure that you understand what their levy contributions are going to be, and maybe even offer to facilitate how they're starting to use the DAS system, because that's where it's all going to happen. That's where the transactions will all take place. So is there a role you can play in supporting your employers in how to use the DAS system? So we can then move on to March. That's when we will hear the outcome of the ITT, and the first successful applications to the register are published. If you're not planning on submitting an application for this round, then the second round of applications comes back open in April. So maybe you're sort of waiting to see and applying in April. But actually in April, employers will start to feel the first monthly instalment come out of their bank accounts via HMRC. So again, it's just, do you understand what your levy paying employers are actually contributing? And also, if you're working with them currently through existing apprenticeship programs, then what impacts does that actually mean in terms of the cash flow moving forward? So, of course, the first delivery under the new apprenticeship arrangements, funding arrangements, happened in May 2017, which really sort of brings us on to the crux of this relationship, of this webinar. Are you ready to deliver? Again, regardless whether it's the standards or the old SACE frameworks, are you now planning to deliver what you need to put in place, the right processes and systems to get ready for that looming deadline, May 2017? So we published an 8-step guide. We ran some webinars last year on an 8-step guide. So this is really a refinement of that based on what we've learned over the last couple of months. We've been out to lots of training providers to hear exactly some of the pain points, some of the challenges, some of the insights, and really this 8-step guide has been put together based on some real interesting conversations with our providers. So I think the first thing that we're saying here is around building an apprenticeship strategy. I think in terms of growth and looking where you need to be from now, in terms of 5 years' time, what does that growth look like? The second stage is evaluating your current offer, doing a health check on what you're delivering at the moment. The third stage is around financial planning, a really crucial stage, especially for your finance directors. I'm not sure if anyone's tuning in today who is from the sort of financial director team's background, but the financial piece I think is really important. The step 4 is around engaging with employers, which will be a huge change to how you engage with employers moving forward once you start to consider contracts and funding arrangements and payment schedules, etc. Step 5 is around defining your offer. You need to be really clear what your offer is going to be moving forward. Have you started to think about price and affordability before you even negotiate with employers? You're going to need to know exactly how much that framework or standard is going to cost the employer once you start talking about co-investment. Do you have the right capability and capacity within your organisations? And we can talk about CPD, how to upskill staff as we move through the webinar. And finally, now we're talking about financial contributions and money passing through various means. Then what are the systems and processes that you need to have in place to make sure you've got contracts absolutely signed and sealed that protect you as the training provider? So do we have a poll question, Jack?
We do. We have our third poll question, which is, are you starting to plan to transition to the new standards? Yes or no?
Let's see what the response is.
Please answer now. So far we have about 90% yes.
Okay.
So everyone's getting on their way.
Yes, absolutely. That's good news. Well, hopefully we're imparting this information to reassure you that clearly what you're doing is on track. But if there's stuff that you have not maybe thought about, then maybe we can cover it today as well. So let's talk about the first stage then. This is all around your apprenticeship strategy. Now, one of the things that I would say is that, within your growth strategy, obviously, generally within your college or training provider, is apprenticeships at the heart of your growth strategy, because that really aligns your strategy with government funding priorities. And as we go through some of the funding scenarios, whether it's on the old frameworks or the new standards, then clearly there are some incentives for you to work with 16 to 18-year-olds. So within your growth strategy, are you targeting 16 to 18-year-olds based on the funding priorities? Obviously, there's uplifts for deprived areas, for looked after children. So when you look at your growth, are you sufficiently working with those particularly priority groups to maximise the funding opportunities that are out there? I think the other thing as well is, I said this before, does your finance director understand some of the financial implications from May onwards? And we're going to look at some of those funding scenarios shortly. I think one of the key things is once you've done those funding scenarios, it's about defending existing business, growing your apprenticeship business in new markets, and whether or not you need to reduce certain aspects of your apprenticeship delivery just because there hasn't been demand in those particular frameworks over the last couple of years. So I think your strategy is really where it needs to start. And I think one of the key things that I would say that it has to start from the very top with absolute buy-in across all departmental areas, from curriculum to marketing, right the way through to other teams. Not just, it can't just be owned, I don't think, within the apprenticeship team. It has to be owned across the organisation to get absolute buy-in. So really just looking at your strategy. So have you reviewed your current offer? What you can see here is probably a typical snapshot of an FE provider in terms of apprenticeship provision. So you can see this is just for illustrative purposes only. So if you're a provider, maybe you've got 50 starts for catering and professional chefs at level 2. So have you sat down and reviewed performance around apprenticeship starts over the last 2 years? How many have been through subcontractors? So when you look at your growth, you probably need to look at how many have been delivered through subcontracting, because clearly those rules are changing as well. How many of those starts have been with 16 to 18-year-olds and 19 plus, because clearly the funding incentives are going to really, really drive that behaviour moving forward. And which areas do you think have grown? So if, for example, health and dental nursing, for example, if you've had some growth in that area and you've got the standard that's ready for delivery, can you start to pilot and work towards that standard? Because when you look at the financial implications, clearly there are going to be some huge incentives to transition, especially where those standards are ready for delivery. So I think that the whole essence of where you probably need to begin is to look at your current offer and really get under the skin of how that's been performing over the last few years, because you may have noticed that 16 to 18 growth has stagnated, and there may be a reason for that. You may need to really look at your recruitment processes as a result of that. So a real snapshot of where you are at the moment is step number 2. So let's look at some of the financial implications. Now, this is something that we've been doing with our providers, sort of taking them through step by step in terms of the current funding and how this is going to look from May onwards. So let's just take an example. So for the level 2 catering and professional chefs, currently the funding for that is just under 5,000. The new proposed funding from May onwards is 2,500. Obviously, there's going to be a bit of a shortfall there. So if you're not considering moving on to the new standard, which is equivalent to the Commis Chef, which obviously you'll get 6,000 for, then clearly there are some serious financial implications for you to consider. And I think it's just a case of looking at the standards where they are ready for delivery, and keeping a watching brief on those standards that are in development, because when they do get ready for delivery, then that's where obviously you'll start to see the funding rates drop on the old frameworks. Now what this doesn't show is the 20% uplift that the government have recently announced on the old frameworks for 16 to 18-year-olds. But when you do start to sit down and work this out line by line, in most cases, in all cases, I would say, it is financially viable on the new standards as opposed to the old framework. So it's great to see from the poll that there are so many of you out there already planning delivery on the new standards as the old framework starts to reduce their funding. So do take a moment after the webinar to look at some other scenarios. The scenario that I wanted to sort of pick out specifically is around the motor vehicle one. And we're close to this as City Girls because we've been developing our own on-programme offer and endpoint assessment for the motor vehicle one. So this is one that I think is going to have significant implications. So if you look at the vehicle maintenance and repair, let's say, for example, if you're working with a number of SMEs who you're putting cohorts through, so let's say, for example, if you were to start a cohort of 10 apprentices on the old framework from May onwards, then the potential funding reduction is £13,000. I think that is a significant drop in funding. However, if you were to start that same cohort on the new standard post-May 2017, the uplift is significant. So those are the kinds of scenarios and those are the kind of decisions that I think you can start to play out internally throughout your organisation to maybe build a case to moving over to the new standards sooner rather than later. These are significant funding changes and uplifts that I think you'll have to seriously consider. So step 3, again, so this is all about, so for example, if you are in a situation where you've got a cohort of, or even individual apprentices, do you start them now on the new standard before May, or do you start them on the new, sorry, on the old framework before May, or do you move on to the new standard? I think it's about really sitting down and taking a hard look at what's in the current framework compared to what's in the new standard, having a real hard comparison of what are the financial incentives around switching, and if you do continue to carry on the SACE, then where are the risks and what are the risks? So I think it's about looking at this on an occupational basis, on a per standard basis, because the pricing is very different, the levels are quite different when you look at some of the progression pathways. So really taking a hard look at which individual occupational standard areas you want to look at and consider switching from SACE sooner rather than later. But what are the advantages? It's not all about, well, clearly funding is a huge driver, but I think one of the key things that you may need to think about is, do you have the right resources in place to move to the new standard? Do you have enough knowledge around the college or your provider around what this actually means? So there's a whole new raft of other decisions that you may need to consider as well. I think if you're not having conversations with your employers about these implications, because when you consider the standards obviously have endpoint assessment, this is a wholesale change in terms of how those apprentices achieve their apprenticeship through endpoint assessment. So are your employers on board with that? Do they understand it? Are they bought into it? So starting to have those conversations with those employers now. And I think some of the standards, and I'm sure you'll agree, offer far more flexibility, especially to meet small business requirements where you can add in units and really bespoke it around that particular job role or for that particular employer. In some cases, they are going to be more attractive for learners. When you look at some of the standards, they are a lot more challenging actually, and some of the endpoint assessments are a lot more challenging when you think about independent assessment and some of the testing that needs to take place at endpoint assessment. And I think crucially, what this is about is staying ahead of your competitors. I think if you can establish yourself as a key advisor to your employers around the apprenticeship reforms and staying ahead of the game with your competitors, then your employers will continue to use you as their provider of choice, and you will remain that key expert and leader in the new apprenticeship reforms. So if you're not in this space at the moment, not having those conversations, not understanding the implications, then all these benefits I think will really start to play out for you in the future. And I think if you're talking to levy paying employers, then there will be lots of providers out there that are trying to build relationships with those levy paying employers. So really start to maximise on those existing relationships that you've got at the moment by showing them that you are the experts in delivering these new standards and endpoint assessment. So let's move on to engaging with employers. As I said before, I think this is a real game changer. Historically or now, you're probably speaking with employers and you've probably never had a situation where any money's changed hands. Maybe you've negotiated any contribution through in-kind support, so maybe you delivered training on their premises and that's sort of been their contribution. Clearly, if the majority of your employers are going to be SMEs, then the co-investment piece, I think, will be a real game changer for how you negotiate with employers. If they're levy fee paying employers, then this is a whole new relationship, because you also become what was historically almost a transactional relationship. So you're going in, you're developing vacancies, you're advertising those vacancies, you're providing candidates, you're building those apprenticeship activities or programs, whereby moving towards more of a trusted advisor role, because employers, whether they're levy fee paying or non-levy fee paying, will not have the time or the space or the experience, I think, to really understand what these reforms are about. And if you need to make sure that they remain engaged, make it easier for them, hide the wiring, almost become their in-house expert for how they can maximise the co-investment opportunity, but also them as a levy-paying employer as well. So I think the whole relationship with employers will change. I think with SMEs, I think it's about, how do you get your teams ready to start to negotiate around price? How do you start to think about what the payment structure looks like, what the contracts look like? I also think, actually, it's an opportunity for you to review your current base, your employer base, and really start to think about, well, if you're not engaging some levy fee paying employees in your area, then how can you? A lot of colleges work really well with their NHS trusts or their local authorities. You may have had a few apprentices in there over the last couple of years, but really start to get your CEO or your principals involved in meeting some of these large employers to start to build those relationships, because it will be a longer term relationship engagement. And just on that, actually, as a side, we are running an employer engagement webinar next week. We'll give you details at the end of this, where we'll go into a lot more detail around how to maximise your relationship with employers. I think we've got a poll question now, have we, Jack?
We do. So our fourth poll question today is, what are your biggest challenges associated with engaging employers to generate business? Please answer now.
So let's see what we've got here.
So far the main one is convincing employers to pay up front for apprenticeship training.
It's really, really interesting. Yeah. That's really interesting, and I think when you look at some of the incentivisation for employers who need to pay up front, obviously if they're recruiting 16 to 18-year-olds, if they are recruiting level 3, then I think the incentivisation payments will mean that their upfront contribution they will get back in the end. But I think you're right, I think there is a conversation to be had about them parting with cash before any training has taken place. Although, to be fair, I think the funding, the co-investments that the government announced quite recently, the 10%, I think is contribution, I think is quite generous, actually. So I think the co-investment will mean that they won't be contributing an enormous amount, but I think for the smaller employer, that smaller amount could actually mean it's quite a lot for them as a small business. So that's really interesting to see, and also negotiating on price as well. Really, really interesting. Well, at the end of this session, we'll talk about additional CPD that City and Guilds are developing to support those two key themes, because I think if we understand more about where those challenges are, then it's our job to make sure we can support you through that and bring in the right expertise. So just in terms of step 4, are you working with the right employers? Again, this is about trying to take some of that pain away from the employer. So I said this earlier on, so do calculate the levy on their behalf. If you've not done so already, the SFA have built some tools, some planning tools around how that levy can be spent. And when you start to look at the cost of some of the standards moving forward, then you can really see where that levy can be best utilised. And I think that's a piece of work that you can do on their behalf as a provider. So for big organisations that you're working with, NHS, local authorities, the police, or maybe you're doing some stuff for other public sector bodies in your area, then do start to make those levy contributions on their behalf. Do you have just in terms of the employers, do they have the appropriate staff? A lot of employers, especially small employers, you know, may have one person that's responsible for learning and development, or maybe in some small employers they don't have anybody who deals with learning and development. You could become that resource. So do try and you know, take the pain away from them, and you know, and do some of that work for them. And I think once you start to invest time and effort with that particular employer, then you will become that provider of choice. So let's move on to defining your offer. I think this is a real change, because we know that providers have historically delivered huge volumes of the frameworks that are out there, and within those frameworks you've got all individual pathways. The transition from frameworks to standards means that they're very job specific, and it will be crazy or actually impossible for you to deliver every single standard. It just won't be financially viable. So I think what this is about is understanding where you think those standards, you know, which demands you think those standards are going to be in. So I think it's about understanding the future skills gaps of your employers in your area, making sure that your offer maps to those future skills gaps. We know from some of the LEPs that we've been talking to, every LEP has identified their skills priorities. We're starting to see some key trends, which are health and social care, digital, IT. Make sure that your standards that you're developing are linked to those future skills gaps. If you've got a very large employer in your area, or even a cluster, an SME sector cluster in your area that is deeply involved in engineering or construction, then you will have those relationships already. But where do you think their future skills gaps are going to be? And what we're seeing on the new standards, a lot of them tend to be level 3 upwards. So is your offer sufficiently developing the higher end levels? Because that's where we're seeing a lot of demand. And talk to your employers about it as well. You know, what are their pain points? We know there's a huge ageing workforce challenge in this country at the moment. We know that the manufacturing industries are losing people over the next 10 years. You know, apprenticeships could be a really good way to start to fill those skills gaps, providing those standards are linked to those jobs which will be in demand moving forward. So it really is about getting out there and doing your research and analysing exactly where those skills gaps are going to be. I don't actually think it's going to be good enough to just offer what you've offered previously. I think it's about really looking at where you think employers are going to be wanting to spend their levy, how they're going to want to spend their levy, or using their co-investment opportunity for SMEs, and really understanding that. And then equally, you need to consider, well, what is your offer in terms of those standards? We know the standards look quite different. Some of them don't have qualifications, so what does your on-programme look like? Have you started to think about your endpoint assessment organisations? Are you having those conversations? Because clearly they will form part of your offer moving forward. So lots to consider, and hopefully you're starting to, or maybe well underway with that research at the moment. So let's look at some of the different scenarios around defining your offer. So obviously it looks very, very different to the old standards. Let me just take you through the motor vehicle one, because this one is an interesting one because it doesn't have a qualification in it, and I think there are all sorts of challenges in there from the on-programme stage to make sure that those apprentices stay on track and they're moving through the on-programme components and getting ready for endpoint assessment. So clearly the on-programme offer is looking at skills test, logbook review and knowledge test during the on-programme stage. It's really important, I think, for the employer, for the training provider and for the apprentice to agree that the apprentice is actually ready to move through to the gateway. So what the gateway will do is review all the work that's happened through the on-programme stage, because clearly that, you know, everyone will have to be reassured that everything is being completed, the master name is being completed, the logbook review, any sort of knowledge test has been completed before they get to gateway. Once they get to gateway and they move to endpoint assessment, you know, we as an endpoint assessment organisation don't want anybody to fail at the endpoint assessment stage. So it's really, really important that we support the on-programme stage. So once they get through endpoint assessment, then this is really about the apprentices being tested by an independent group or a set of assessors that they've not met before, they've not seen before, at a venue that they may have not been to before. So it's all very, very different, and it presents with lots of challenges. So I think it's really important that the apprentice is supported across the entire journey, because once they get to endpoint assessment and they have to do a whole range of things, whether it's observational, whether it's an assessment, obviously they're going to be graded at the end of that. And that is all very, very different, and it's very different across individual standards. So I think when we look at pricing as we move forward, then you do need to cost in every single aspect, including endpoint assessment. So the different aspects of your offer, clearly there's going to be following options, so qualifications based, so this is around your delivery model that will include the learning and practical training to prepare for the mandatory assessments which the Trailblazer Group has specified. So that's quite straightforward where there's a qualification in it. For a bespoke programme, this is where you might want to develop your own programme of learning to make sure that the apprentice prepares for endpoint assessment. And then the final one is where you would bespoke that programme with accreditation. So where there's no qualification, you can still accredit that programme with an awarding organisation. So lots of different models for you to consider. I think how you engage with employers, it's about awareness days. You know, are you sort of getting out and about there, or are you holding road shows, which I think is quite a good idea, or getting employees into the college or into the training provider to really get them to understand what this actually means. Offering support around initial assessment of those candidates, supporting the recruitment to make sure you get the right people in those apprenticeship opportunities, and publicity. I mean, the publicity piece around the changes to apprenticeships and the key changes to the reforms, I think will position you as the expert in the field around apprenticeships to your employers. So let's just look at choosing your assessment organisation. Obviously, this is part of the agreement. So when you negotiate the cost of the standard with your employer, that will also include the cost of endpoint assessment. Now, employers have the final choice to who they want to work with in terms of endpoint assessment, but clearly you will have a huge role in recommending an endpoint assessment organisation to your employer, but ultimately the government is saying that the employer will have final choice, but you will negotiate with your employer the overall cost of that particular standard, including, so you would have to cost it in the cost of endpoint assessment in order to make that pricing affordable. I think it's really important just to refer to the guidance that's out there around that. There will be agreements in place, which I'll come on to shortly, what this looks like in terms of roles and responsibilities. But I think when you are looking at which standards, you have to do that alongside the endpoint assessment piece as well, because the endpoint assessment plans are all very different, and the pricing structures are all very different as well. So how can we support you around endpoint assessment? There are various ways in which we want to support endpoint assessment. So we've got 4 typical delivery models. So the first one that we could be, so obviously we are developing, I think we've got 20 endpoint assessments that are available at the moment. If you go to our website, you can see which occupational areas they're in and how we're approaching this, obviously, because we need to find our assessors to go out and deliver endpoint assessment. So the first option would be that we contract with freelance assessors, which is what we're doing at the moment. Or we could also work with you to arrange for the release and contract with assessors from our partners, as long as they've had no part in that particular training. So that's something that we could do with you. We could subcontract for the use of assessors from partner organisations and colleges. So that discussion is still very up for negotiation, because clearly, you know, these assessors are going to be required for a very different role in a very different setup. And then the final areas that we could want to work with you around hiring venues. You will have some amazing facilities that we will need to look at in order to undertake those endpoint assessments, especially when you look at some of the facilities that you have in, say, I don't know, construction or engineering, where the setup of those venues are going to be absolutely essential for making sure that those endpoint assessments are as real and are as similar to a work environment. So that they are just some of the ways in which we want to have a conversation with you around how we want to partner around endpoint assessments. There's also an email address there at the bottom of the page for you to go to send an inquiry, and then we can send one of our experts out to have a conversation with you about which endpoint assessment occupational areas you are interested in. So let's look at pricing and affordability. This is an area that you're going to have to consider as part of the process. So I think before you have any conversation with an employer about price, you will really have had to work out internally your pricing strategy, your affordability. So when you consider the standard that you're considering to offer that employer, what overheads are you going to incur? What does the programme look like? What is the cost of endpoint assessment? Economies of scale, can you offer that employer any sort of price incentives if you're going to be delivering to a large volume of apprentices? Do you put in exclusivity agreements with that particular employer? So if they're going to be working with you, very large cohorts, then could you look to economies of scale? So these are the kind of things that you're going to have to really set out. Just on the endpoint assessment again, obviously your pricing structure will need, you have to put in some wriggle room there to make sure that you've got the flexibility to negotiate. It has to fall between the maximum funding available, unless that employer wants to contribute more, actually. So I just think it's a real sort of step change for providers to consider in terms of how do you start to negotiate that with an employer. And when do you walk away? When is it just not financially viable for you to deliver that particular standard to that employer because they're really trying to sort of negotiate you down on price? You do have to make this commercially viable for you to continue as a business. So some really, really interesting. And what I would say is to clearly spec this out on an individual standard case by case basis. So we move to step 7, which is all about capacity and capability. Obviously, you may need to think about, do you need to reorganise your workforce to really step up to some of these challenges? Have you got the right experience within your college provider base? So obviously we've talked a lot about contract negotiation. That's clearly come up in the polls around how do you have that conversation around cost, around price, nailing down the contract so it's within your best interests. Is that experience, is that skill set in there? Do you have the right technology available? What kind of internal capabilities are you going to need? So one of the things that we've noted is the change from the assessor role that's currently in place at the moment. Those assessors that you have in place at the moment may move towards a teaching-based role. So is there sort of an upskilling or a reskilling that you need to do there? Business development training, I think this is a key aspect of your business development teams, your sales teams that are the front-facing teams for your organisation that are going to go out and sell apprenticeships and sell the concept of co-investment. So the concept of contributing up front, they will need to be really, really on the ball with return on investment, with being able to demonstrate added value that apprenticeship has provided to that business. Do you have the right resources in place? We know that for many colleges, the apprenticeship resource is quite small compared to the full-time provision. Is there some kind of balancing that you need to do, some rebalancing that you need to do around those resources to make sure that you've got the right people in the right place at the right time? And what kind of schedule do you need to work towards from now until May 2017? do you have a project plan that factors in all these different areas? And crucially, what contractual agreements with employers. We know that the AELP are putting together some templates around what that looks like. So there's a lot of support out there, a lot of help out there. So do get involved and try and seek out what support. And also, we're offering some support as well, which I can talk about at the end. And how you evaluate all of this. So I think it's really important to sort of make sure that you're constantly checking what's working well, what isn't working well. Is everyone on board with some of the key changes? Does everybody understand, why this is changing and how this is changing, and really start to consider this as a whole organisation approach. So we're just going to talk about marketing. So obviously marketing is going to be key to how you develop your proposition. I think one of the key things for me is what sets you apart from your competitors. Historically, lots of colleges have offered the same thing, has offered the same frameworks, whatever. What are you going to be doing that's different to your competitors down the road? Are you going to specialise or position yourself as a specialist in technology or in advanced manufacturing? There must be a unique selling point that you think you do well. If you're based in an area where you've got lots of technology companies, then is your USP around digital, technology, creative, that sort of thing? I think one of the things that I would suggest as a tactical opportunity is to maybe, I know quite a few of you have done some levy events, so opening your doors to all your levy paying employers, giving them some free advice and guidance, making sure that they continue to work with you as the provider of choice. Employer summits, maybe you can do something specific around sectors to support SMEs. We know that SMEs really like you to understand their language and know their sectors, know their industries. So is there something that you can do around summits? I said this at the beginning, but one of the things I think works really well is if your CEO or principals really invest some serious time in writing to all your levy paying employers, invite them into the college. If you've got some amazing hospitality and catering facilities, then host a sort of dinner evening. Make sure you've got some key figureheads involved, so identify who could be an ambassador for the college or training provider. I know this works really well from some of the colleges that I've worked with, where you've got some very well-known employees in the area who are prepared to promote the college or the training provider and be an ambassador, and encourage that sort of peer-to-peer to all the businesses to encourage them to use you as a college. And also be the expert. You're not just about pure sales, it's about overall relationship management. And I think that is the way to go. It's not good enough, I don't think, for you to go in and turn a vacancy around and then walk away only for another training provider to come in and swoop in and take over that business. This is about owning the relationship from a strategic point of view, if you want to see the benefits in the future. So we are heading towards the end now, so we do have some time for some questions, but this final slide is just around the new systems and processes. I've kind of laboured this point a lot really during the session, but I think it's really key to make sure you've got the right people lined up who are going to lead on negotiation with employers. It might be that the people that you've got in at the moment may need some upskilling, some reskilling. We're developing some CPD in the future around supporting your staff in that, so do look out for what we're offering. The apprenticeship agreement, I think, is going to be critical, because obviously that will state out exactly the commitment from all parties, which I think is really, really important. So the employer knows what their responsibility is, so does the provider, and so does the apprentice or the parent if they're under 18. Some final points to consider. Obviously, you're probably on with your ITT now for non-levy paying employers and the register for apprenticeships. Have you finalised all written agreements? Payment schedules need to be clear, and just some other key things then, obviously, are you having the conversations with employers about any additional modules that they want to incorporate, like qualifications? Just note that even though some of the apprenticeships don't have any qualifications on the new standards, an employer can choose to put one in. I think the jury's out actually whether the levy would pay for that. I think at the moment the government is saying they wouldn't pay for those qualifications where the standard didn't stipulate it, but I think that's a watch this space. So do be flexible with employers and do offer them the opportunity to add in additional bits to meet the specific needs of that job or role profile. So finally, taking things further with us, obviously we've got a whole raft of support that we're offering our providers. So we talked a lot about looking at your organisational readiness. Then this is around sort of helping you understand your current position, where you are at the moment and where you need to be. So it goes back to that sort of health check and helping you to get ready for the apprenticeship reforms, the standards, the funding systems, helping you define your offer so we can come in and we can help you really shape what your offer should look like based on future gaps, future skills gaps or current skills gaps, and how this links to employers and how this links to what those standards actually look like. We're also running some employer CPD, look out on the website, but just for information, we've got a session running in Warrington on Monday. If you do want details on that, Jack, what's the best process for people to get in contact with you? Have we got contact details that we're going to be sending out?
For the employer CPD event?
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be Nicole Butler at cityandguilds.com.
Yeah, okay.
So that was on the previous webinars, but we will include that in the following up email with slides and the Q&A.
Brilliant. Okay, so that's a piece of training that we're doing at the moment. We're also developing some training around the transition from your assessor role into more of a teaching role. We're developing that as we speak. So if you're interested in that, again, do let us know. And we do do we have a final poll, Jack?
Yeah. So the final poll of today is: what is the biggest challenge associated with developing and delivering a change program? Just bring up the poll.
Let's have a look. Final question.
Change in work practices, changing processes and job roles, developing a marketing strategy, investment requirements, or proactive business and development.
Okay. Let's see what people say. And just while you're all doing that, we've had a fantastic response to today's webinar. We've had a phenomenal number of people joining, so really, really grateful and really happy that you're all getting involved. So what are the key findings there? It
seems so far people are changing between changing work practices and changing processes and job roles.
Right. Okay.
So the key issues.
Interesting.
We're going to close this poll now. So we now have about 10 minutes left for our Q&A. I'll just share the results first.
While that's happening, can I just give a shameless plug to another webinar that we're running on employer engagement, which may tackle some of the issues that you're raising on the poll today, actually. So we're running another webinar next week around employer engagement. So, Jack, what are the times for that again?
That's 3:30 till 4:30 on Monday the 28th of November.
So do take part in that if you're around. So we're going to move to questions. We've got a little bit of time for that. So
yeah. So our first question is from Alex Sheldon, which is: can you further explain the co-investment for micro business? Is it really non-existent?
So what did you say? Oh, all right, okay. So yeah, in terms of the non-existent for micro, so basically what the government has said, if you're working with an employer who has less than 50 staff, and that's 49 staff actually, so it's not 50, it's 49 staff, then there will be no expectation for that employer to co-invest.
Our next question is from Michael Lomas. Can we complete the pre-registers, example UKPRN, commissioners, etc., early for April 17 application without doing the ROATP?
Can you repeat that, sorry?
Can we complete the pre-registers, example UKPRN, commissioners, early for April 17 application without doing ROATP?
I think that's one for our funding expert.
Yeah, we might come back to you on that answer.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to give you false technical information. It's quite, that is a quite technical question. But Brian, our resident funding expert, we can come back to you on that one straight away.
Our next question is from Michael Oddie. How much notice are we getting for frameworks being switched off? Is there a standard notice period?
Well, that's an interesting question, Michael. I mean, normally what we're finding is that once the standard is ready for delivery, then the government are giving probably around 3 to 6 months for that framework to be switched off. That's certainly what we've seen in other areas. So I think the key thing is to watch out for those standards that are in development when they move for delivery. So you've probably got access to the website. That they're constantly updating that, it's constantly being reviewed. You have to go in and check basically, but it's roughly about 3 to 6 months. I'd say 6 months to be on the cautious side.
We have another question from Michael Oddie, which is, although we have to evidence employer contribution in our accounts, i.e. real payment being made, does anything stop us from incentivizing employers ourselves, i.e. helping reduce the pain financially?
Just repeat that again, sorry?
Although we have to evidence employer contribution in our accounts, does anything stop us from incentivizing employers ourselves?
No, I think that's absolutely down to your relationship with that particular employer. I think if you've got a really good relationship with an employer, then you would want to build those additional incentives, and I would encourage you to do that, absolutely.
Our next question is from Caroline Mount. Currently, apprentices are being paid. Many employers can access the age grant to assist with this payment. Will this still be available?
I think the age grant has been replaced by some of the funding, the funding uplifts around 16 to 18. So when you look at the spreadsheets that the SFA put up and you start to really map the old frameworks pricing from May onwards, some of them do the 20% 16 to 18 uplifts will probably cover what was the old age grant, but if you look at the standard, there are some additional incentive payments as well. So I don't think the age grant will continue unless your local enterprise partnerships have alternative incentives, which I may not know about, but the uplift is to replace the old age grant support.
Our next question is from Richard Chambers, which is, do you think there will be a change in the reduction of funding for frameworks if replacement standards are not available?
It's a good question. I think obviously we know that the standards are coming out very slowly. The government really flexed on when all these standards should be fully implemented. So they're saying now by 2020 all standards will be fully implemented. I think it would be unfair for the funding to be significantly reduced on those frameworks where there isn't a standard ready for delivery, hence why I think we've had some of the uplift that we've seen. But I think it's one, it's certainly one to watch, and it's certainly one to feed into the SFA around what their response would be around that.
Our next question is from Catherine Ball, which is, can providers join the assessment provider register at any point, or is there a window to apply? The assessment provider register.
The assessment provider register, is that for the is that to become an endpoint assessment? Yeah. Well, if you go onto the SFA website, there are lots of links and lots of tools. We could probably do it, send them some links actually after this. But if you just type in endpoint assessment guide, and then you'll have lots of rules in there about how to become an endpoint assessment organisation. I think there's various things that you need to consider in that one.
Pauline has a quick question, which is, how can we offer standards if there is no EPA centres available?
Well, yes, this is the killer question. I think this is the challenge that the government are having, and if you read anything in FE Week, then of course this is going to be one of the significant challenges for the sector, where there's no endpoint assessment organisations available. I would raise that, and I would make sure that you're lobbying for those particular issues with the government.
Another question is from Donna Marie. What evidence of activity will be required for standards without qualifications?
I think, again, it varies per standard. I think if you go into the standard that you're looking into or that you're referring to, they will have a whole list of behaviours, competencies that they would need to demonstrate before they move in towards endpoint assessment, and they all look very, very different. For some of the technical ones, there could be some assessments, there could be logbooks. I mean, there's a whole range of different things. I think what you need to do is to really sit down and look exactly at the content of each standard. And clearly, where there is no qualification in there, you may want to put in some additional bits to make sure that there's some evidence that that learner is actually progressing.
We have a question from Gillian, which is any guidance on 20% off the job training?
I think the only guidance for the off-the-job training is to make sure that sufficient time is given to that apprentice to do some of the off-the-job training. Many employers in the past, I think, have been quite reluctant to provide the off-the-job training. Again, this should be in your contract, your agreements that you make with that particular employer about what the off-the-job looks like and how the off-the-job will be delivered. So it could be that they come out to you as a training provider, or it could be that you go into them in the workplace. I think that is to be negotiated.
All right, thank you so much for attending today. We will be sending out an email tomorrow with the Q&As from today, which especially the ones we didn't get to, the slides, as well as some key links, I think Paula said, for you to check out yourself. Now, there is a short survey at the end of this webinar, just to help us in the future webinars. If you could please do that, it should take about 30 seconds. Thank you so much.
Thank you.